We grant the extension of time in respect of the finding of contempt in Leeds Crown Court and allow the appeal against that finding for the detailed reasons set out in the judgment, essentially because the process was flawed.
This morning at precisely 10:04 a.m, the UK Supreme Court released a sealed judgment that had been hidden from the public eye for weeks. Its contents, a damning revelation that Sir Keir Starmer's private assurances to EU negotiators directly contradict his public promises to the British electorate. Inside that judgment, buried beneath legal jargon and redacted memos, lies a single explosive sentence. It is the court's view that the leader of the opposition has sought to influence ongoing EU negotiations while intentionally misrepresenting his position to the British public. That line alone sent shockwaves through Westminster. Within hours, #StarmerExposed was trending across every platform. The Labour front bench descended into chaos, whips were summoned, emergency meetings held, journalists swarmed outside Parliament like bees to a burning hive, and inside Downing Street, panic turned to calculation, because the Prime Minister knew this could change everything. For years, Starmer had walked a tightrope between leave and remain, between promises of sovereignty and whispers of realignment. He promised to make Brexit work, but never quite explained how. He vowed to respect the referendum while surrounding himself with advisers who never did. And all the while he built a reputation as the calm, collected former prosecutor, the adult in the room, the man of principle. But tonight, that reputation lies in ruins. Because the court's findings point to something far darker than hypocrisy. They suggest premeditated deceit. Sources now confirm that Starmer held multiple undisclosed meetings with senior EU officials in Brussels between May and August. In those meetings, he allegedly outlined a pathway to rejoining key European structures, the customs union, the single market, and potentially more. And while those talks were dressed up as exploratory, internal EU memos now leaked suggest the opposite. One senior diplomat reportedly described Starmer as committed, strategic and willing to override domestic constraints for the sake of European reintegration. That quote alone has detonated across British media like a political hand grenade. But here's where the betrayal deepens. During the very same period, Starmer appeared on British television insisting there would be no return to freedom of movement, that Labour would not reverse Brexit, and that any relationship with Brussels would be practical, not political. These weren't vague comments. These were direct, emphatic denials. And now, under oath, through evidence and via the highest legal body in the land, they've been exposed as fiction. The reaction has been furious. Former Labour voters in red wall seats feel duped. Union leaders have called emergency councils. One senior Labour MP reportedly told aides, "He's finished. We've been lied to, just like Blair on Iraq." And then came the intervention that changed everything. I anticipated everything. Buckingham Palace. Just hours after the ruling, it emerged that King Charles was privately briefed on the court's findings. While the palace has remained silent publicly, insiders report that the sovereign was deeply disturbed by the implication of political deceit at the highest levels. For a monarch who has largely avoided political entanglements, even quiet disapproval could reshape public perception. And then, like fuel on a fire, Nigel Farage returned to the stage. In a televised broadcast this evening, Farage declared, I warned you Starmer was preparing to sell us back to Brussels. And now the court has confirmed it. This is the greatest political betrayal since Maastricht, and the people won't stand for it." His words struck a nerve. Protesters gathered outside Labour HQ within the hour, waving Union Jacks and chanting, "No return, no betrayal." Inside Labour's war room, there is silence, no official response from Starmer. No press conference, no apology, only a short lawyer-drafted statement denying any wrongdoing and condemning the politicisation of legal matters. But for many, that statement is too little, too late. The damage is done, the deception exposed. And yet this scandal runs deeper than one man, because if Starmer has been secretly negotiating a return to Europe, what else has he promised behind closed doors? Who else in his party knew? And how far does this betrayal truly reach? The nation stands at a crossroads. A moral reckoning that cuts deeper than left or right, Brexit or Remain. It strikes at the heart of trust, of sovereignty, of leadership itself. If the man who promised to respect the people's decision has been working to reverse it, what does that mean for democracy? The silence was deafening. As Westminster reeled from the Supreme Court's revelation, a deeper current of dread began to swell beneath the surface. This wasn't just about Starmer anymore. This was about the soul of the nation, about whether the will of the British people had ever truly mattered. Because while the headlines screamed of one man's betrayal, behind the curtain a darker truth was beginning to emerge. A coordinated effort, years in the making, to quietly drag Britain back into the grip of Brussels, one handshake at a time. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs into leaks. Within 24 hours of the ruling, a classified briefing was leaked from inside the Foreign Office. The document, marked Eyes Only, revealed a series of internal discussions that aligned disturbingly with the court's findings. Meetings, strategy sessions and covert communications between Labour policy aides and European think tanks. It outlined a phased plan to reintegrate the UK into the EU's economic orbit, starting with energy cooperation, followed by regulatory alignment and culminating in customs re-entry. But it didn't stop there. The final phase of the plan was simply titled Political Reintegration, Consultation and Public Messaging Framework. That chilling phrase, public messaging framework, sent Parliament into meltdown. What it implied was staggering. Not just intent, not just betrayal, but a psychological campaign, a strategy to manipulate public opinion, to soften the population, to pave the way for the very thing they had once fought to escape. In plain terms, a roadmap to undo Brexit, not by vote, not by referendum, but by stealth. The media descended like vultures. Pressure mounted on Labour MPs to go on the record. Some cracked. One shadow cabinet member anonymously admitted on live radio that Starmer had been increasingly drawn to the idea of a quiet realignment and that communications had been ongoing since 2022. That bombshell sent trust in the party into freefall. The latest snap poll showed Labour's lead evaporating in under 18 hours, a political collapse not seen since the days of Gordon Brown's premiership crisis. Tory backbenchers, once fractured and leaderless, found a sudden and potent unity for the first time in years. They smelt blood, not just in the water, but in the air. But the fury wasn't limited to Westminster. Across the country, ordinary citizens who had voted leave out of principle, out of hope, out of belief in self-rule, now felt humiliated, betrayed not by the elites they'd expected to deceive them, but by the man who had promised to restore honour to politics. Starmer wasn't just accused of lying, he was accused of conspiring, of orchestrating the very reversal of a democratic decision behind the veil of civility and calm. And yet, as damning as the court's ruling was, it was what came next that truly shattered public confidence. At 3:17 p.m, during an emergency committee hearing on national security implications, a Home Office official dropped a revelation so explosive it forced the suspension of the session. The official, visibly shaken, confirmed that intelligence briefings over the past year had flagged an escalating pattern of foreign influence operations aimed at shaping UK public sentiment on EU re-entry. And more disturbing still, the briefings identified multiple contacts between foreign agents and unnamed opposition figures. The implication was impossible to ignore. Starmer's alleged betrayal may not have been a solo act. It may have been part of something far more coordinated, possibly even foreign-backed. As murmurs of espionage and manipulation echoed through Parliament's darkened halls, questions turned toward MILS 5 and GCHQ. Were they aware? Did they warn anyone? And if they did, why wasn't it stopped? Rumours erupted that Whitehall's top brass had already begun quiet damage control to prevent further reputational collapse. Former intelligence chiefs began issuing vague public statements urging calm and institutional trust. But the damage was irreversible because now it wasn't just a legal scandal, it was a national security emergency. Meanwhile, inside Labour HQ, aides were reportedly panicking. Phone lines lit up, legal teams were called back from holiday, senior staffers deleted social media accounts. It was political triage, live and unfiltered. And yet, through all of it, Starmer remained silent. No televised address, no press conference, no apology. And then came the leak that turned political fire into national fury. An anonymous whistleblower released a private voice memo to a leading political podcast. The recording, authenticated by 3 independent sources, captured Starmer speaking candidly to a closed group of party donors during a London dinner. As dawn broke over Westminster the next morning, the weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air. Not just in government corridors or party HQs, but across every pub, household and school in Britain. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a voice, a calculated strategy backed by legal evidence, digital forensics, and a trail of leaked promises. The Supreme Court's ruling had lit the match. The voice memo poured petrol. Now the country was burning with a single question. How far does this go? The morning headlines didn't even attempt restraint. Starmer's secret coup, democracy undone, Labour's European plot, the British press, from tabloids to broadsheets, sang in rare harmony. But this was no longer a partisan issue. It had crossed every line. If what we were seeing was true, it meant that for over 2 years, the man vying to become Prime Minister was actively involved in what many now describe as a political reverse engineering of Brexit, carried out behind closed doors, financed by obscure donors, and executed under the guise of diplomatic neutrality. But the real horror, it had almost worked. Internal messages leaked from Starmer's campaign advisors revealed how close they had come to finalising Phase 1 footage. Formal alignment with the EU's standards body. A backdoor entry into the regulatory framework Britain fought so hard to leave. Documents outlined media softening strategies, Red Wall reintegration paths, and most disturbingly, a confidential section titled Public Compliance Phases. Those 3 words detonated like a bomb across the nation. The phrasing was clinical, as if the British people were cattle to be herded, not citizens to be consulted. Within minutes, commentators drew chilling parallels with past political psy-ops. The deception wasn't just political, it was psychological, shaping opinion, not by debate, but through carefully curated exposure. Pundits from both ends of the spectrum began asking if democracy had quietly eroded while everyone was looking elsewhere. Some even dared to use the word treason. Not lightly, but with trembling gravity. After all, if foreign actors were involved, if sovereignty was compromised in secret, then the consequences weren't just political, they were constitutional. And that's when it happened. Parliament, already on the edge, erupted into open confrontation at precisely 11:26 a.m. The Speaker was forced to suspend the House of Commons after a fiery altercation broke out between backbench MPs. Screams echoed across the chamber. One Tory MP reportedly shouted, "You sold out this country for a seat in Brussels." Labour benches, stunned and fragmented, offered no defence. The camera panned to where Starmer should have been sitting. His seat? Empty. It wasn't just his party crumbling. I'd say it could be. It was his very claim to public office. By midday, an emergency session was called. A joint parliamentary inquiry was demanded, not just into the Supreme Court ruling, but into all communications, donations and travel records linked to Labour's leadership. A vote of no confidence began circulating. Petitions surged online, one titled, "Protect Our Vote, Investigate Labour's EU Plot," gained 1.2 million signatures in 6 hours. There was no denying it anymore that this wasn't the scandal of the decade. This was the reckoning of a generation. But even as the political world convulsed, something far more disturbing was brewing underneath. A series of encrypted messages began circulating on anonymous channels, allegedly from whistleblowers within both the Labour and EU bureaucracies. These messages outlined in shocking detail an entire post-election roadmap that had been pre-approved by unnamed European officials. The plan? A 24-month realignment agreement drafted, edited and waiting for parliamentary rubber stamping immediately following a Labour majority. The memo described Starmer as reliable but flexible and willing to withstand short-term backlash. One line in particular froze the nation. We anticipate initial resistance, but control of key media narratives will facilitate smooth integration. That was it, the final line crossed. Media networks were forced to address their own culpability. Commentators who once downplayed Starmer's EU intentions were now apologising live on air. Former BBC political editors issued statements expressing deep regret at failing to scrutinise deeper. The public didn't want apologies, they wanted justice, they wanted transparency, they wanted to know how many knew and for how long, but there was still one more twist. Late that evening, an independent journalist from the Netherlands published evidence showing that members of Starmer's campaign team had made personal financial gains from consulting firms tied to EU policy lobbying. These firms, based in Luxembourg, Berlin and Paris, had quietly awarded political advisory fees to individuals within Starmer's circle. The aftermath of Starmer's exposure didn't just shake Parliament. It fractured the very identity of modern Britain. The foundations weren't just political, they were psychological, cultural, spiritual. For years, the British people were told that their voices had been heard, that the referendum was the final word, that democracy, however messy, had spoken with clarity. But now, that promise lies in ashes. Because in the hearts of millions, a haunting question echoes louder than any speech: was it all a lie? As news of foreign-backed influence campaigns merged with leaked documents and financial trails, the entire political class found itself on trial. Not in the courts, but in the streets, the homes, the consciousness of a betrayed nation. Town hall meetings were hijacked by furious citizens. MPs were shouted down in public. School children began asking their teachers whether votes still mattered. And in the corridors of power, panic turned to paralysis. The machinery of government stalled. Every policy, every announcement was now seen through the lens of suspicion. Ministers hesitated to speak. Bureaucrats leaked in fear. For the first time in decades, Britain was facing not just a crisis of leadership, but a crisis of belief. Meanwhile, Scotland seized the moment. Nicola Sturgeon's successor, emboldened by Westminster's implosion, delivered an emergency address calling the scandal proof that Westminster will never respect the will of any nation. Including Scotland, independence rallies erupted overnight. Welsh nationalists followed suit. The fragile union that had held together through wars and economic shocks now trembled on the edge of fragmentation. Not from outside attack, but from internal rot. And yet, amid the chaos, a new energy surged through the people. Not despair, or not yet, but something deeper, older, ancestral. The spirit of defiance. In cities and villages alike, grassroots movements began to rise, not tethered to any one party, but bound by a shared demand. Accountability, transparency, a rebirth of trust. They called it the reset. And it wasn't a slogan, it was a declaration, a firestorm of public awakening that no spin doctor could contain. Yet the establishment did what it always does when cornered. It tried to discredit. They called the protest populist, unhelpful, even extremist. But the more they mocked, the stronger the movement grew. And then came the final insult, a leaked government memo showing that Whitehall had quietly drafted disinformation countermeasures aimed at monitoring anti-EU sentiment online under the guise of national security. In other words, dissent was to be tracked, criticism was to be catalogued. Freedom of speech was no longer protected, it was profiled. The backlash was nuclear. Journalists, even those loyal to the establishment, turned. Civil liberties organisations filed lawsuits. One judge, speaking off record, described the memo as the most flagrant assault on expression since the Cold War. The illusion shattered completely. What began as a scandal about Starmer now revealed itself as a decades-long erosion of the people's voice. Every vote manipulated, every fear weaponised, every truth delayed, redacted or denied, all for the sake of stability. But as the old world collapsed, a new question rose from the rubble. Who will lead the rebuilding? with Starmer politically destroyed and Labour in retreat, a leadership vacuum opened. Rishi Sunak, still Prime Minister, attempted to seize the moment. He promised reform, promised oversight, but few believed him. He was, after all, the beneficiary of his enemy's failure, not the architect of a new future. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson's hints of return grew louder. His allies began appearing on